I don't think anyone in the village really notices the old hill the way I do. To them, it's just a slope covered in dry grass and low shrubs, where the goats sometimes wander and the wind smells faintly of earth. But for me, that hill feels like the edge of something bigger. My grandfather says it's because I spend too much time looking at stones instead of chasing after life. He laughs when he says it, but I know he doesn't mean it in a bad way. I think he can tell that I like to imagine what happened here before our village was even here, before the olive trees grew, before the soil was even tilled for the first time. One late afternoon, when the sky was melting into those deep golds and pinks, I was sitting near the crest of the hill, and I noticed something strange, a piece of bone half buried in the dust. It wasn't from any animal I'd seen before. Not a goat, not a sheep, not even a cow. The shape was different. The ridge of it felt heavier, almost too solid for its size. I didn't know it then, but that little piece of bone was my first real connection to a creature that had lived here nearly 9 million years ago, a time before humans, before the idea of humans even existed. Later that week, an old friend of my father's came to visit. Professor Nico, a paleontologist who taught at the city university. He had a way of speaking that made everything sound important, like the air around us thickened with meaning. When I showed him the bone, his eyebrows lifted so high I thought they might touch his hairline. "Where did you find this?" he asked, pointed toward the hill. "Just up there." It was sticking out of the dirt. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting the lines and texture. "Do you know what this might be?" I shook my head. "It could belong to Ouranopithecus," he said, slowly, almost like he was testing the taste of the word. "A very old primate, perhaps one of the last of its kind in this region. Your hill may be older than anyone in your village has ever imagined." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept whispering the name under my breath. Ouranopithecus. It felt strange, like carrying an ancient secret in my mouth. The next morning, Professor Nico asked my parents if I could help him explore the hill for a few days. My parents agreed, though my mother warned me to be careful around strangers, digging up the earth. She's like that, cautious about anything unusual. We began early before the sun climbed high. The hill wasn't much to look at, patches of dry grass, dusty soil, and the occasional stubborn rock. But once we started brushing away layers of dirt, tiny pieces of the past began to appear, a fragment of a jaw, a worn molar, part of what could have been a finger bone. Nico explained everything in a way that didn't feel like a lesson, more like he was letting me in on a secret. Ouranopithecus macedoniensis, he told me, lived around 9 million years ago in what is now Greece and the Balkans. Imagine this land, not dry and brown, but green, with dense forests, rivers winding through, and animals unlike anything you've seen today. They were among the last of the great apes in Europe before the climate began to change. I tried to picture it. The hill transformed into a thick forest, the air heavy with damp leaves, the sounds of strange birds and the calls of creatures I couldn't quite imagine yet. "What happened to them?" I asked. He paused. "The earth changed. The forests began to shrink. Open grasslands took over, and with less food and new predators, they disappeared. It made me feel strange, a mix of sadness and awe. I'd never thought much about how entire kinds of creatures could vanish, leaving nothing but a few pieces of bone under the ground. By the third day, we had a small collection laid out on a cloth under the shade of a tree. Nico kept looking at one particular find, part of a skull, worn but unmistakably from something not human, yet eerily close. "Do you see this ridge here?" he said, pointing to the brow bone. "It's much heavier than in humans, and the jaw would have been powerful for chewing tough vegetation, but the eyes would have faced forward just like yours." That detail stuck with me. Forward-facing eyes. It made them feel less like distant creatures from a dusty museum shelf and more like someone I could have met, someone who might have looked right at me across a clearing in that ancient forest. When we packed up that afternoon, Nico said he would take the bones to the lab for further study. But before he left, he turned to me and said, "You found this hill. Remember that. Sometimes the greatest discoveries start because someone simply noticed something others walked past." As I watched him drive away, a thought settled in my mind like a seed in soil. If Ouranopithecus had lived here, maybe other ancient beings had too. Maybe the ground beneath my feet was a library, and every stone, every bone, was a page waiting to be read. That night, lying in bed, I imagined walking through that ancient forest. The light would be softer there, filtering through leaves that no longer exist. Somewhere above me, a shape would move in the branches, broad-shouldered, long-armed, with eyes that locked on mine. Not a man, not a monkey, something in between. Something from the very beginning of what would one day become us. And for the first time in my life, the hill beyond the village didn't feel like the edge of the world. It felt like the beginning. That night, after everyone in the house had fallen asleep, I stayed awake staring at the ceiling. My mind kept wandering back to that fragment of skull Professor Nico had shown me. I imagined what it must have looked like whole, not just as a piece of fossil, but as a living head with skin, fur, and eyes that watched the world around it. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, the darkness of my room faded, and the sound of crickets outside was replaced by something deeper. The hum of wind in thick leaves, the sharp cries of birds I didn't recognize. When I opened my eyes, the hill was gone. In its place was a forest. The ground was soft under my bare feet, covered in damp moss and tangled roots. Sunlight spilled in pale gold beams between massive tree trunks, the air warm but heavy with moisture. Every step I took released a smell, not the dry dust of my village, but the green, breathing scent of plants that grew tall and wild. Something moved above me. I looked up and saw branches swaying, not from the wind, but from a figure climbing through them. Its arms were long and strong, pulling it easily between the limbs. The fur was dark, but streaked with sunlit brown, and when it paused, I could see its face. Forward-facing eyes. A ridge above them. A jaw that looked powerful enough to crack hard fruit. It was Ouranopithecus. It didn't look at me like an animal. Would, startled and ready to flee. It looked at me like I was simply part of the forest, another creature among many. There was no fear in its eyes, only curiosity. A second figure appeared, smaller, moving quickly along the branches. This one carried something in its mouth, what looked like a cluster of leaves and seeds. They sat together on a thick branch, legs dangling, eating slowly. I stood there watching, hardly daring to breathe. From somewhere deeper in the forest came a chorus of sounds, low hoots, sharp clicks, and a kind of chattering that seemed to pass between the trees like invisible threads. The air was alive with voices I didn't understand, but somehow felt the meaning of. Then I noticed how many other creatures filled this world. Small antelope-like animals grazed on the edges of the forest where the sunlight was stronger. Bright feathered birds darted between trees. Insects buzzed lazily, their wings catching the light. Everything seemed connected, every sound blending into the rhythm of the place. I walked further, my feet sinking into the damp soil until the trees began to thin. Ahead of me, the green gave way to an open stretch of grassland. I could feel the change. The sun hit hotter here, and the wind was stronger. It carried with it a new smell, sharp and dry. Professor Nico's voice echoed in my memory. The forest began to shrink. Open grasslands took over. I turned back to look at the tree line. The Ouranopithecus still sat in the branches, but their gaze was on the open land, not me. It was as if they knew something I didn't, that this grassland wasn't just a new view, but the beginning of the end for them. Still, they climbed higher, searching for fruit and leaves, their world shrinking without them knowing just how quickly it would happen. Somewhere beyond the grass, I saw movement, shapes low, to the ground, moving together in silence. I couldn't tell what they were, but I felt the tension in the air shift. Even the birds went quiet. The Ouranopithecus froze for a moment before retreating deeper into the branches. I wanted to follow them, but the forest seemed darker now. The sounds I had found so full of life now felt cautious. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the distance. The sky above the grassland began to change, clouds gathering in shades of gray and silver. A storm was coming. The Ouranopithecus began to move quickly through the trees, heading toward higher ground. I ran beneath them, my feet slipping on wet roots, the forest closing around me. As the first drops of rain fell, I looked up one last time and saw the larger one. The one I had first noticed stop and glance down at me. Our eyes met again. For a moment, it was like we were two creatures caught between worlds, me from the future, them from the past, both trying to understand something we couldn't put into words. Then the rain came harder, blurring everything. Blinked, and the forest was gone. I was lying in my bed, the sound of the storm outside my window matching the one I had just heard. My room smelled faintly of damp earth, though I couldn't tell if that was real or something my mind had carried back with me. In the morning, the hill would still be there, quiet and ordinary. But I knew better now. I had walked through its memory, seen the ones who had lived there before time had names, and I wasn't going to stop until I learned more. The morning after the storm, the whole village smelled different, fresh, almost sweet, as if the rain had washed away not just dust but time itself. The hill beyond the village glistened in the early light. Professor Nico was already there. When I arrived, his hands deep in a wooden crate. He looked up when he saw me, smiling in that quick, distracted way he had when his mind was already racing ahead. "You're just in time," he said. "We're going to start cleaning the new finds." The new finds were the bones we'd uncovered the day before. Not much to look at yet, just shapes in hardened soil. But when Nico set them on the table beneath his tent and began brushing them with the softest movements, they seemed to shift from being mere objects to something almost alive. "This," he said, pointing to a curved fragment, "is part of a jaw. Look at the wear on these teeth. That tells us what it ate. Probably tough vegetation, maybe seeds and unripe fruit." I leaned closer. The teeth were flat, worn like tiny millstones. "And this," he went on, lifting another piece, "might be part of the pelvis. If we're right, it could tell us how it moved, whether it spent most of its time in the trees or came down to the ground." I didn't tell him that I already knew how they moved. I could still see them in my mind, climbing through the forest like water flowing between branches. We worked for hours. The hill seemed to give us more each day, not just bones, but hints of the life they once held, bits of fossilized wood, seeds hardened into stone, a fragment of what Nico thought might be an ancient bird's wing bone. "Every piece is part of the puzzle," he said, arranging them on a large sheet of paper where he had drawn a rough outline of a skeleton. "It's like listening to a voice, but hearing only one word at a time." That night I fell asleep thinking about the puzzle, and just like before, I woke in another time. The forest was brighter this time, the air buzzing with insects. I was standing near a stream, the water clear enough to see fish darting between smooth stones. The Ouranopithecus were there too. Not the same ones I had seen before, but others, their fur lighter in the sun. One sat near the water, breaking open something that looked like a hard fruit. It used a rock, holding it steady in one hand while striking with the other until the shell cracked. The sound echoed faintly across the stream. I remembered Nico saying they weren't tool makers like humans, but seeing this, I wondered if maybe they had been closer than we thought. The smaller ones moved quickly, sometimes upright, sometimes on all fours. When they stood, their bodies swayed slightly, as if the ground felt less familiar than the trees. But they didn't seem afraid of it, only curious. A sudden movement made them freeze. A shadow passed over the water, large wings, the kind that belonged to a bird of prey. The smaller ones huddled closer to the bigger adults who watched. The sky until the shadow was gone. I realized then how much their lives depended on watching, listening, and reacting faster than danger could reach them. Every sound mattered. Every change in the wind might carry a warning. As I moved closer to the stream, my foot caught on something hard buried in the mud. I bent down and pulled it free, a smooth, rounded piece of bone. It was shaped just like the jaw fragment Nico had shown me earlier. When I looked up, one of the Ouranopithecus was watching me. Not afraid, not angry, just watching. Its eyes were dark and steady like deep water that held things you couldn't see. The sound of rushing water grew louder until it filled everything, and then I woke up. The morning light was slanting through my window, and in my hand I was still holding something. My heart jumped, but when I opened my palm, it was just the small, smooth stone I kept by my bed. Still, for a moment, I almost believed it might have been the bone. When I got to the hill that day, Nico was excited. "We've got something new," he said, motioning me over. There, on the table, was a jaw fragment, almost exactly like the one I'd seen in my dream. Same curve, same worn teeth. "Where did you find it?" I asked. "In the stream bed on the far side of the hill," he replied. "It must have washed down during the rains." I didn't tell him that I already knew about that stream, or that I'd been there last night. Sometimes I think the bones aren't just giving us the past, they're calling us into it. By the 4th week, the hill felt less like a place I visited and more like a place I belonged to. Every morning, I woke before the rooster crowed, grabbed a piece of bread, and climbed the dusty path where the air was still cool and the shadows of the olive trees stretched long. Professor Nico's tent had grown into something like a small camp. 2 work tables now, crates stacked high, and a long board where he'd pinned drawings of bones next to sketches of what he thought Ouranopithecus might have looked like. On that board, the skeleton was slowly taking shape. A partial skull at the top, vertebrae forming a line, a curve of ribs. It was like watching a shadow step out of the earth and into the light. But the more complete the skeleton became, the stranger my nights grew. The dreams, if they were dreams, were changing. They weren't just scenes anymore. They felt like a story unfolding piece by piece, as if the past itself was guiding me toward something. That night, the air in my room was heavy, and I fell asleep quickly. The forest appeared again, but it was different now. The edges felt thinner. Where the trees had once been endless, now there were gaps, open patches where grass was pushing through. The calls of birds seemed sharper, and the wind carried a dryness I hadn't felt before. I saw them, the Ouranopithecus, moving slower than before. The older ones sat more, chewing for longer on what little fruit they could find. One female carried a tiny one clinging to her chest, its eyes half closed, tired. A sound rolled through the forest, not thunder this time, but the low, distant rumble of large hooves. A group of antelope-like creatures crossed an open patch, their heads lifting every few moments to scan for danger. It was the grasslands creeping closer, claiming more space. From a high branch, the largest male watched the horizon. His chest rose and fell slowly, but his eyes never left that dry, bright land. I felt it. He knew. Not in words, but in some deep, ancient way, he knew their forest was shrinking. I tried to call out to him, but my voice made no sound here. My feet carried me toward the open space beyond the trees. The ground was hot under my toes now, the air sharper. I knelt and touched. The earth, it crumbled like dry bread in my hand, and then in the distance, I saw shapes. Not predators this time, not exactly, but they moved with a quiet purpose, on 2 legs instead of 4. They were smaller than humans, their arms longer, their bodies lean, built for both climbing and walking. They weren't Ouranopithecus, and yet they weren't strangers either. They bent low, scanning the ground, picking at plants, cracking seeds between their teeth. I remembered Nico talking about early ancestors of humans appearing as the climate changed, creatures adapting to the new, open world. One of them looked at me, head tilted, as though I were the unusual one here. Then, just as suddenly, it turned and vanished into the tall grass. When I woke, the sound of wind in my ears lingered, as if the grassland had followed me home. That morning, when I reached the hill, Nico was studying something with his magnifying glass. "Look at this," he said, handing me a small piece of bone. "It's not Ouranopithecus. Different size, different shape. Found in the same layer, though. Could be from a later primate that survived after them." The bone was smooth and light, and holding it gave me the same unsettled feeling as seeing those other figures in my dream. It was as if the hill wasn't just showing me Ouranopithecus, but the moment when their world gave way to another. As the sun rose higher, I caught myself staring at the horizon beyond the hill, where the land grew pale and flat. I wondered if the grasslands out there had been waiting all along, patient and unstoppable, just like in my dreams. That night, I knew the story would continue, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next. The dreams didn't wait for me anymore. They came as soon as my eyes closed, as if the hill itself had decided I was part of the story now. This time, the forest didn't greet me with its usual chorus. No chattering birds, no insect hum. Only the wind, restless and dry, pushing through the thinning leaves. The Ouranopithecus were scattered. The big male I had seen so many times before sat alone, high in a fig tree, stripped almost. Bare. He plucked the last few fruits one by one, chewing slowly, his eyes scanning the ground far below. When I looked down, I saw why he was watching. The open grassland was closer than ever, creeping like a tide into the edges of the forest. The air shimmered in the heat, and beyond the grasses, dust rose in faint clouds. The younger ones no longer played. They clung to their mothers or followed them quietly from tree to tree, pausing often to chew dry leaves or gnaw at bark. I walked deeper into the forest, my bare feet kicking up dry soil instead of the soft moss I'd first felt in my earliest dream. There were stumps now, not from axes, but from trees that had simply died and toppled, their roots exposed to the air. Near the stream, the water was lower, moving sluggishly. The banks that had once been crowded with plants were now bare, cracked in places. I crouched down, touching the surface, and felt the warmth of it. Warmer than it should have been. From the corner of my eye, movement, not in the trees, but in the grassland. I turned and saw them again, the smaller, upright walkers. They moved more confidently now, venturing into the edges of the forest to gather food. Their eyes were sharp, their movements quick. One bent to pick something from the ground, a seed pod, and cracked it with a stone before passing it to another. It struck me then. They were living in both worlds at once. They could climb if they had to, but the open land was becoming theirs. The Ouranopithecus, for all their strength in the trees, stayed high and watched. They didn't follow. I tried to call out to them, to warn them somehow that their world was ending, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. The scene shifted. Without warning, I was now watching the big male again, but something was wrong. His movements were slow, labored. He gripped the branch tightly, as if even the simple act of sitting upright required effort. A younger one climbed up to him, offering a strip of bark. He took it, chewed, and then turned his gaze outward again, always toward the grassland. I realized it wasn't just hunger or heat pressing on them. It was change itself, slow enough to ignore for a while, but constant, relentless. The forest would never be what it was, and they didn't know how to live anywhere else. When I woke, the first thing I heard was the wind in the olive trees. Outside my window, it was dry, carrying dust from the far fields. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still in the dream or back in my own world. That morning at the hill, Nico was quiet. He'd found something new. Not another bone, but a layer of pale, powdery soil in the excavation trench. "This," he said, scooping some into his palm, "is wind-blown dust, sediment carried from drier areas. It means the environment here was changing, drying out." I stared at it in his hand. It looked exactly like the dust from the grassland in my dream. "Nico," I said slowly, "how fast can something like that happen?" He thought for a moment. Fast enough for one generation to notice, slow enough for them to think they could adapt, until it was too late. I didn't tell him what I'd been seeing at night. I didn't tell him that the big male still watched the horizon, as if he was waiting for something that would never come. Because deep down, I knew, the next time I dreamed, the forest would be even smaller. And one day soon, I'd open my eyes there and find it gone. That night, when the dream took me, I didn't find myself in the heart of the forest. Instead, I stood at its very edge. Behind me, the trees, thinner now, their leaves sparse and pale. Before me, the grassland stretched far, endless in the heat. The line between the two worlds had shifted again, and the trees were losing. The Ouranopithecus were fewer. I counted only 5 from where I stood, their movements slow and careful. Even the younger ones seemed aged, their ribs showing through, their fur. The big male was still there, though. His fur had lost some of its sheen, and his shoulders looked heavier, as if each movement was weighed down by more than just fatigue. He was perched in a low tree, scanning the grassland in silence. I followed his gaze. Out there, the smaller upright walkers, the ones I had seen before, were moving in groups, bending to gather seeds and roots. They carried them in handfuls, stopping to crack them open with stones. They were thriving here, in the new world of open space and hard ground. One of them stood upright for a long moment, looking back toward the forest. It was too far for me to see its expression, but something about the way it turned its head made me feel as though it understood exactly what was happening, that it knew the forest was no longer a place for them, and that the ones who stayed would not last. In the Ouranopithecus group, the younger female with the infant clinging to her, Belly tried to cross to another tree. She had to climb down and walk across a patch of bare earth to get there. Halfway across, she paused, her eyes darting to the tall grass. I felt the wind shift. The grass moved in a way that wasn't just the wind. Something was watching. The big male descended quickly, cutting across the ground to reach her. His speed surprised me. Even weakened, he could still move like lightning when it mattered. He guided her the rest of the way to the next tree, climbing up behind her, his eyes still scanning the grass. Nothing emerged, but the air stayed tense. I sat at the base of a tree, watching them. The infant peered at me over its mother's shoulder, eyes wide, as if it could see me when the others could not. I wanted to tell it that I knew. I knew its world was vanishing, that soon even the safest trees would be gone. But I didn't have the words, and even if I did, they would mean nothing here. A dry wind swept through, and with it, a strange quiet. No birds, no insects. The forest had stopped singing. I blinked. and suddenly I was back on the hill in my own time, sitting in the dirt beside the excavation trench. My hands were dusty, my knees scraped. I must have sleepwalked here, though I couldn't remember leaving my bed. Nico was already at the site, kneeling over something in the soil. "You're here early," he said without looking up. "Look at this." It was a nearly complete skull, Ouranopithecus, unmistakable. The ridges above the eyes, the heavy jaw. I couldn't help but feel it was the big male. "This one was found near the very top of the layer," Nico said softly. "That means it's among the last of them in this area. The last of them." The wind picked up across the hill, carrying a whisper of dust from the far grasslands. I closed my eyes and could almost hear the forest again. Not the living forest of my first dream, but the one from last night, quiet and waiting for the end. I didn't tell Nico that I thought I had just been with this Ouranopithecus hours before we uncovered him, or that I could still see the horizon he'd been watching when the trees went silent. Because now I was sure of it. The next time I dreamed, it would be the end. I think the hill knew it was coming. The day before the dream, the air in the village felt heavier than usual. The sun was white and sharp, the kind of heat that seems to take sound away. Even the goats didn't wander far, choosing the shadows of low stone walls instead. When I got to the excavation site, Nico wasn't talking much. He was measuring the depth of a trench, his brows pulled tight. "The soil here," he muttered. "It changes so suddenly, like something shifted quickly, too quickly." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. That night I lay in bed and waited for the forest to find me. When it did, I was standing in the tallest tree I had ever seen, the wind moving through its upper branches. From here, I could see everything. The thinning forest. Behind me, the grassland stretching far into the horizon ahead. The Ouranopithecus were gathered in one place, all of them. There were only 4 now, the big male, the younger female with the infant, and 2 others. They moved without speaking, their eyes scanning the trees around them as if deciding whether to stay or to move. The big male climbed to a high branch, almost level with where I stood. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping the grassland. Again. I could see it in his posture, the weight of watching for so long, for something that would never be reversed. Below us, the grass shivered, not from wind. Shapes moved in it, low and silent. The female gripped the infant closer and shifted higher into the branches. The big male let out a low, deep sound, not fear exactly, but something older, heavier. The kind of sound that says, "This is the way it is now." For a moment, his eyes met mine, and this time I knew he was seeing me, not as part of his world, but as something from far beyond it, a witness, maybe the last one he would ever have. The others huddled together, their bodies touching, the infant's small hands gripping fur. The big male stayed apart, one hand resting on the trunk of the tree, eyes fixed on the grass. Then, without warning, the wind shifted, and the smell of the grassland swept over us. Dry, sharp, endless. The big male didn't move. He just kept, watching, as though he'd decided he would meet the end standing. And then the forest faded, not all at once, but like the edges of a painting dissolving into blank space. The trees lost their leaves, the air lost its heaviness, the sounds faded until there was only wind. The Ouranopithecus were gone. I was left standing alone in a bare field that stretched forever in every direction. When I woke, my pillow was damp. I wasn't sure if it was sweat or tears. At the hill that morning, Nico uncovered the last piece of the skeleton. He said something about the skull fitting perfectly with the jaw we'd found earlier, but I barely heard him. My eyes were on the horizon, where the land dipped into pale, dry grass. The big male had been right. That was the future. and now it had no room left for his kind. The day we left the site, the sky was the clearest I had ever seen it. Nico stood beside the crates that held the bones, his hand resting on one like it was something fragile, alive. The rest of the team busied themselves with notes, photographs, and careful labeling, but I just stood there, staring at the trench. It looked so ordinary now, a shallow cut into the hillside, the dirt piled to one side. If you didn't know, you'd never guess that only days ago a story older than memory had been lying there. I thought about the big male in my dreams, standing alone in that last tree. I thought about how his world had been ending and he had still kept watch, as though his gaze mattered. On the ride back to the village, I couldn't stop glancing at the crates. Nico noticed. "You've been quieter than usual," he said. I told him about the dreams, not every detail, just enough that he knew I'd been thinking about them. He didn't laugh. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the land tells us stories in ways we don't expect. Maybe you just listen better than most." That night, I didn't dream of the forest. Instead, I saw the hill itself, not as it was now, but as it had been, green, wild, alive with the hum of insects. I saw roots twisting deep into the soil, wrapping themselves around the bones as if they knew they were keeping something safe. I woke with a strange certainty. The hill remembered everything, the rains, the winds, the lives that came and went. It had been patient, holding on to its story until someone came along who cared enough to dig. In the days that followed, I noticed how different everything felt. The world seemed bigger, but also more fragile. The mountains on the horizon looked older than I could really imagine. The river's sound seemed like it had been flowing forever, and I kept thinking about how the Ouranopithecus had stood between two worlds, one fading, one beginning. How, without knowing it, they were the bridge that would eventually lead to us. One afternoon, I walked to the top of the hill alone. The trench was already half filled in, grass starting to grow over it. The wind moved through the blades, carrying the same dry scent from my dreams. I closed my eyes and listened. Somewhere deep in the earth, I imagined I could still hear them. The rustle of leaves, the slow, deliberate movement of hands on bark, the low hum of a voice that had no words. When I opened my eyes, the sun was sinking behind the ridge. The light turned the land gold, just like it must have been millions of years ago. I whispered, "I saw you," even though there was no one there to hear it. And for a moment, I could almost feel the hill answer.